The final warning, what the CIA's Blue Book never printed. The envelope was stamped "Final Warning" in block letters, and the last page wasn't there. A countdown scrawled in pencil, 30 days, stopped at 22. An archivist's hands shook as she traced a redacted sentence where the motive should have been. One word wasn't blacked out: Siphon. Meanwhile, a diagram from the missing chapter matched a modern anomaly no one could explain. Blue Book was supposed to calm the public. This wasn't calming. They'd kept a double ledger: the pamphlets you saw and the annex you didn't. If the chapter was real, it tied non-human activity to water and magnetism. To see why they buried it, we need to go back to the night everything shifted. The public story versus the hidden file. On paper, Project Blue Book was a pressure valve. Phone banks, form letters, standardized language. Swamp gas, meteor showers, Venus low on the horizon. Reassurance memos crafted in an office with fluorescent hum, the kind of prose that turns panic into paperwork. The public posture was simple: identify, explain, move on. Calm the phones, feed the headlines, keep the airliners on time. Blue Book ran from 1947 to 1969, logging 12,618 reports with 701 unidentified. Behind it, another current ran. Certain reports, quietly labeled special handling, didn't follow the public route. They went lateral, straight into CIA and the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were structured. Multiple sensors, repeat events, proximity to things that mattered. Those didn't get the pamphlet. They got a courier. After the 1953 Robertson panel, the CIA's guidance emphasized public debunking while sensitive cases moved into intelligence lanes. Get this, one analyst inside that hallway of silence called them nocturne cases. He worked nights in a windowless room at Wright-Patterson, the kind with 2 clocks on the wall, neither set to local time. He'd been a meteorology officer before radar brought him inside. He kept a photo of his daughter on the console, tucked in the frame behind a strip of masking tape with a list of frequencies. He'd tell friends he did maps. He didn't add that sometimes the maps looked like a heartbeat. Here's where it started to split. The Air Force needed fear management. The intelligence side needed threat assessment. Those two can't comfortably live in the same paragraph. One says, tell people not to worry. The other says, what if we're the ones who should? So the same sighting could produce 2 products, one for the press, one for a room with no phones. He noticed clustering the way you notice a song you've heard before. Pins on a map that wouldn't spread out. Not bases, not airports, water, reservoirs, pumping stations, dam spillways. The pins weren't random, they were hydrological. Meanwhile, a separate set traced along transmission corridors and substations, as if someone had drawn a line across the sky and the incidents decided to follow it. He pulled copies of maintenance schedules. The hair went up on his arms. Outages and peaks. When water plants were open to air. When the grid ran hot. The stakes didn't look theoretical anymore. You could switch to Venus and weather balloons for a page, but the pins didn't move. People in cities drink because those systems work. Families sleep in hospitals that depend on precise current. You can't hand-wave that with optical illusions. He filed a memo. Polite, tight, with only nouns and verbs. He wrote, temporal clustering during maintenance intervals, adjacency to high-energy infrastructure, and one careful line, suggestive of targeted interaction rather than incidental collocation. He didn't write "they're here." He wrote pattern. It's a safer word. It was also truer. The response didn't come on letterhead. It came as a routing change. Water-adjacent cases were to be flagged with a new internal code. It appeared as a stamp in violet ink the first time he saw it. FW7. Final warning, someone joked in the break room. No one laughed. Codes are supposed to be boring. This one felt like a throat clearing before a sentence they didn't want to finish. Meanwhile, the public face doubled down. Press guidance included a new paragraph on mirage phenomena over bodies of water. Hydrology notes were stripped from summaries before release. A nighttime photo of lights near a dam became training flares. The analyst watched a line he wrote, pressure drop at intake, disappear in the public version. That wasn't an edit. It was a nerve being numbed. This mirrors a broader practice from the 1950s, 1960s. Reassure publicly, analyze quietly. He wasn't alone. At Langley, an OSI liaison started logging magnetometer oddities alongside the blue pins. Pilots were filing compass drift notes with their flight surgeons because they felt embarrassed putting them in official logs. Across town, a lab physicist testing coil interference on a bench wrote, in his notebook, repeatable 6 Hz banding during low-altitude pass, unknown source. None of them knew each other. Their notes did. Then the map did something it hadn't done before. The pins began to cluster not just near water, but near places where water meets pressure, intakes, spillway gates, siphon structures, paired with grid nodes that were already strained. It was as if the events were reading the system. The analyst circled 3 reservoirs on different coasts, all with maintenance windows scheduled within the same week. He didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in calendars. He went upstairs. He asked for instrumentation Blue Book didn't control. Hydrophones placed at intakes, magnetometer arrays near substations, synchronized clocks. He got told to coordinate. That meant wait. That also meant someone else would make the decision, and if they said no, the pattern would keep humming in the walls where no one could hear it. Meanwhile, on television, a retired colonel waved off a question about sightings near dams with a line about fishing boats and atmospheric lensing. The analyst turned the sound down. He read a new directive, all water interface reports to be routed FW7 within an hour, copies to CIA/OSI. The code repeated like a heartbeat in the margins. FW7 in the upper right. FW7 in the routing box. FW7 on a manila folder that held 3 photos of still water with just the slightest dimple in the center, like a glass being tapped from below. What nobody knew at the time was that the same code would appear on a chapter that never reached a printer. Before FW7 was a file, it was a conclusion someone didn't want public. Before it was a joke in a break room, it was a warning in a draft. And before we can read that draft, we need to sit with the moment the data stopped whispering and started to speak. The pattern nobody was supposed to see. He spread the map on the metal table and pushed the pins aside, replacing them with grease pencil rings. The first ring caught 3 reservoirs that fed 2 million people. The second ring traced a chain of dams across a dry valley that only looked calm on postcards. Every circle intersected water that moved because machines made it move, pumped, gated, siphoned. He added a transparent overlay with blue lines for canals and black dots for intakes. The dots lit up like a constellation that nobody had taught in school. Stakes first. If these weren't random lights but deliberate approaches to water systems, then cities were one maintenance window away from thirst. It wasn't abstract. Operators worked graveyard shifts so faucets would run at dawn. Those people were the ones who'd feel a pressure drop in their bones before anyone else did. Hospitals would feel it next. Dialysis units. NICU incubators. The analyst wrote that down because naming the stakes kept the room honest. Action followed. Reports showed timing that felt like someone checking locks. Appearances at 2:13 a.m. when a pump was down for bearing inspection. A hover at 5:42 p.m. on a July day when demand was peaking and engineers had bypassed a filter to keep up. Body descriptions repeated. Silent, no rotor wash, a kind of vertical dart that climbed like a thrown coin. On the water, operators logged disturbances with no wind, concentric ripples moving inward as if the lake breathed in. A microstory stuck to the file. Midnight, a municipal plant in the foothills. The night operator, a man who collected antique radios, had just set a fresh cup of coffee by the control board when the low-pressure alarm chattered. He looked up at the intake gauge, saw it fall 2 psi in a second, then another, then stop. He grabbed the flashlight, ran out onto the great catwalk. The air was still. No vehicles. No birds. He aimed the light at the black surface and caught a ring widening without a center. The cup slipped. It hit the concrete, shattered, coffee climbing his pant leg in silence because the alarm drowned everything else. Impact showed up as memos. Internal notes ordered hydrology details removed from public releases. Phrases like column disturbance, sustained draw, and intake oscillation were scratched out before the case hit the public summary. Instead, lights in vicinity of recreational lake, likely flares. Meanwhile, inside, routing changed again. Anything water adjacent got the FW7 stamp and skipped the press tree entirely. Geography wasn't the only map. Time drew its own. Sightings clustered during scheduled maintenance outages like moths to a porch bulb. Thursdays at 0:20. First Sunday at 230 during quarterly valve tests. Holiday weekends when skeleton crews ran bigger territories. The analyst laid the time bars against energy demand graphs and felt the click. Peak loads on the grid coincided with water demand spikes. Incidents perched on those ridgelines like a hawk on a fence post. Behavioral notes tightened the profile. Witnesses described a silence that wasn't quiet so much as subtraction, the way it feels under a heavy blanket of snow. Dogs went from barking to a sound like keening, then stopped. People reported pressure in the sinuses, and a taste like a coin in the mouth. Over water, the objects moved with surgical restraint, hovering at consistent heights, drifting over spillway lips, then stepping up in instantaneous verticals as if the air had rungs. Stakes sharpened. If you accept the water interaction as intentional, then motive shifts from sightseeing to harvest. The analyst didn't write harvest in his notes yet, but he circled intake structures and underlined the times. He sent a query to a hydrologist at another base under a pretext about cavitation research. The answer came back: real uptake leaves turbulence, microbubbles, noise. These files showed none. If that was true, something was interacting with water without touching it the way we understand. Complication hit from the top. Public affairs insisted on simplifying narratives, and hydrology details complicated them. So reports split in two. The public got misperception over water. The inside got pressure fluctuations concurrent with visual. The split meant the people with public credibility were forced to say things the data didn't support, while the people with the data couldn't speak. That kind of fracture isn't sustainable. It creates pressure the way a dam does. Another layer appeared: magnetometer anomalies. A field technician at a power substation logged a compass that drifted 5 degrees and then snapped back, coincident with a visual over the canal half a mile away. A geology grad student running a cheap flux gate near a reservoir for an unrelated survey found repeatable spikes around midnight across 3 nights. He posted a note on a campus bulletin board. OSI pulled it down by morning and called his advisor. The student kept the graph. He mailed it to himself. Impact traveled in ripples. An internal bulletin directed all water interface sightings to FW7 within 60 minutes. Another memo suggested cross-referencing grid protection trips with local UAP reports. A third hinted at a hypothesis without naming it: energy exchange at interfaces, monitor both domains. That sentence walked right up to the line and didn't cross it. But water wasn't the only system acting strange, and even the careful language couldn't contain what the lab started to see. Coils picked up interference bands at low altitude overpasses. Navigators wrote, "Headings won't hold," in margins they knew would be censored. Meanwhile, back at the reservoirs, maintenance windows that had always been routine began to feel like bait someone else had chosen. The analyst added a final note to the page: pattern persists independent of personnel and public narrative. Recommend instrumentation at interfaces before next outage cycle. He underlined before. He'd learned that timing wasn't a detail. It was the point. And every time he looked at the pins, the word he hadn't written yet came back like a tide: siphon. Lines in the sky, magnetism as a target. While the water maps thickened, another set of lines started to glow. Lines you can't see unless a needle tells you. Magnetometers near incidents twitched, then sagged, then snapped back like rubber bands. Field techs called it wander. It didn't last long. 10 seconds. 20. Just enough to make compasses stop agreeing with each other, and with the world. Modern efforts, from UAPX field campaigns to university magnetometer deployments, target this exact signature. Stakes first. Navigation is trust. A heading that holds means planes land, ships dock, ambulances find the right street. Satellites rely on a field that behaves. If the planet's magnetic scaffolding buckles, even a little, the systems we stacked on top of it start to rattle. You can't reboot a compass in a cockpit at night. Action followed in 2 threads. On the ground, substation crews recorded odd trips. Protective relays opening for transient faults nobody could find afterward. Operators heard the thunk, watched breakers swing, and then stared at clean diagnostics. Across the river, someone reported silent lights stepping over the canal like stones across a stream. The timing matched within a minute. In the air, a B-52 navigator flying a training route over the plains wrote 3 words he knew would get redlined: headings won't hold. The Euro was fine. The stars were where they should be. But the compass card drifted 3 degrees left, then 5, then slid back like it remembered itself. He gripped the chart hard enough to crease it and kept his voice level. The pilot said nothing. They both knew the board would call them tired if they pushed it. Compass drift and radio interference are among the most common physiological and instrument reports in UAP cases. Meanwhile, in a lab with coil rigs and humming power supplies, a physicist testing for benign interference kept catching a weird ladder in the spectrum, bands spaced. Near 6 Hz, riding on top of everything else during low-altitude passes. She thought it was electrical noise from a bad ground until the pattern repeated with different power sources. She wrote, "Repeatable interference in test coils coincident with overflight, external origin suspected." It was the most cautious way she could say, "Something out there is talking to magnetic fields." A declassified sketch made its way into a folder labeled dull and misfiled. Field lines bending around an object like taffy heated just enough to yield, not break. It wasn't dramatic, no beam, no flash. Just curves that shouldn't be that soft. The caption used conservative words, localized distortion, temporary gradient. But the drawing told a simpler story. The object wasn't simply moving through the field. It was shaping it, stakes sharpened. If these events can tug on field lines, they can tug on anything that trusts those lines, compasses, torquers, even shielding relying on predictable geomagnetic behavior. Space weather teams plan for solar tantrums. They don't plan for selective, localized breathing in the field, right where infrastructure hums. What nobody knew at the time was how often the grid notes and the sky notes whispered the same minute marks. A substation's event log at 21 hours 14 minutes and 7 seconds. A rancher's report of a silent object clearing his windbreak at 21 hours 14 minutes and 10 seconds. A river gauge that hiccuped at 21 hours 14 minutes and 12 seconds. Different instruments, same clock. The analyst pinned those times and wrote a small word that meant more than he let on. Paired. Parallel action tightened the noose. While the navigator fought drift, a geophysics grad student on the ground collected a clean magnetometer trace with a neat, shallow sag at the same moment. He didn't know the bomber was overhead. He just knew his needle bowed like a reed and then stood back up. He thought he'd discovered a calibration issue. He repeated the test and got the same bow. He smiled, then frowned. He filed it under noise, then pulled it back out and mailed the plot to himself. This was the moment everything changed for the analysts. Water interactions looked like motive. Magnetic interactions looked like method. You don't have to touch water if you can touch the field that orders it. If your propulsion, or whatever passes for it, leans on coupling with magnetic lines, then reservoirs and substations aren't locations. They're handles. And if you can grab a handle, you can drink without a straw. The 2004 Nimitz cases, Whitewater, and Hydrosilence motif is a flagship example of an interface without contact. The lab physicist's notes started sketching something that would matter later. Siphoning vectors drawn as faint arrows along field lines, converging at points where water interfaces sat within a few hundred meters of grid hardware. She didn't call them siphoning yet. She wrote energy exchange directions with a question mark the size of her whole day. Her colleague, a ham radio hobbyist on weekends, added a note: low-frequency sidebands present during local reports. The picture wasn't pretty, but it was consistent. Impact came in ripples. A regional utility quietly added magnetometers at select substations without telling their comms team why. An Air Force memo suggested logging compass anomalies with more granularity, even if no one wanted to see those logs in daylight. The analyst got permission, barely, to request synchronized timekeeping across water plants and grid nodes in 3 test counties. Synchronized clocks meant matching breaths. Then came the night the field itself seemed to breathe. A line crew near a river watched handheld compasses all drift together a few degrees east, hold, and slide back as a black shape with a soft, not quite light glow traced the canal. No wind, no sound. The foreman, 20 years on the job and allergic to drama, said, "It felt like a truck idled inside my chest." His men nodded like they'd all held the same breath. He wrote it down the way the program taught him: time, location, instruments, deviation, return. He didn't write what he thought. The analyst did. In his margin, underlined twice, he put a single word the redactors would later miss for one glorious copy: vectors. The Siphon Hypothesis. They stopped calling them craft in the notes and started calling them effects. That was the pivot. Not vehicles skimming lakes, but fields reaching in. The analyst wrote it plain. If the interaction is with the medium, the object is incidental. What matters is the footprint it leaves in water and magnetism. You don't need a pump if you can rearrange inertia at the interface. That's where Siphon stopped being a word in a redaction and became a model in a room. He reframed the anti-inertia stories people love to mock. The instant accelerations, the right-angle turns that make pilots swear into dead channels. They read as violations until you treat inertia not as an absolute, but as something locally shaped. If a field couples waters, mass and the magnetic lines that organize it, then momentum can be nudged in ways our throttles can't mimic. Under that lens, the leap from a lake to a vertical climb isn't a stunt. It's a transfer. Water gives, the field takes, the object rides the gradient like a surfer catching a set. They pulled case files and lined up the details nobody releases. Water uptake without displacement, gauges falling without cavitation, surfaces disturbed inward, not out. Cavitation leaves scars, noise, microbubbles, pitted metal. These events left none. Hydrophones recorded absence, a hole where sound should have lived. The physicist wrote, zero cavitation signature concurrent with pressure drop. The hydrologist circled it and wrote impossible in pencil, then crossed it out and wrote unfamiliar. Stakes sharpened once motive shifted. Tourism never explained timing. Harvest did. A harvest model turns dotted lights into sorties. It reads maintenance windows like schedules and loads like menus. If something harvests energy or structure at interfaces, kinetic from moving water, electromagnetic from stressed grids, then our infrastructure is not scenery, it's prey. The analyst kept his sentences short because short felt safer. If motive is extraction, we must change posture. Blue Book officially claimed no threat, but later programs and modern AARO work acknowledged the need to assess potential impacts on systems. Inside the building, the split went hot. Skeptics clung to instrumentation error, to human misperception, to the comfort of normalcy. Pattern analysts pushed prints across tables, dared doubters to explain synchronized anomalies across domains. Careers edged the argument. A major with a bright future called it clustered hysteria in a meeting and got a promotion 6 months later. A captain who said, "The water is telling us something," found himself reassigned to weather summaries in Alaska. They weren't just arguing a model. They were arguing over who gets to keep a badge. There was one problem the analyst couldn't right away. Proof required gear Blue Book didn't control. The Air Force could ask. Utilities could refuse. Civilian hydrology labs could ghost calls. And even if everyone agreed, you had to place sensors where the problem lived. At intake mouths, within spillway mists, on substation fences, then sync them to clocks no one shared. Evidence had a supply chain, so they designed a trap. Quietly, carefully, they sketched an experiment that would never survive daylight if it leaked. The plan needed 3 things: an interface likely to draw attention, instruments that could ride the edge of the effect without burning out, and a story to coax the event to show up. They picked a reservoir with a maintenance window already posted. They added hydrophones just upstream of the intake with shielding that wouldn't stop physics but might keep tape recorders alive. They borrowed magnetometers from a university under a geology pretext and bolted them to rails nobody notices at night. They synchronized clocks to the second with a lab time source and checked the checks 3 times. Then they laid bait the way fishermen do, a scheduled leak. Not water, but information. A routine memo about a temporary bypass, due to bearing inspection, was allowed to float into a place where they suspected ears were already pressed to the glass. They coordinated decoy lighting patterns on the far side of the lake, soft pulses timed to grid load ramps, to see if the field's attention could be nudged. They didn't call it a lure in the paperwork. They called it Operational Lighting Test. Even among allies, the plan drew a line. One colonel called it reckless and dangerous, another called it overdue. The lab physicist worried the magnetometers would saturate. The hydrologist warned the hydrophones might record nothing, and they'd learn the wrong lesson. The analyst listened, nodded, and wrote the risk on the board where no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. If no effect, reputational cost. If effect, escalation. In the margins of his notebook, he added a human sentence he didn't intend to show. I want to be wrong. He wasn't looking for wonder. He was looking for a way to stop circling the same set of pins while newspapers joked about Venus. The Siphon model explained too much too cleanly to ignore. But models can seduce. He reminded himself that nature doesn't care about our tidy arrows. Then he sketched the arrows anyway. Vectors along field lines, converging at the intake mouth, curling up into a column that didn't displace water so much as ask it to step aside. He drew a second set reaching for the substation like a hand to a banister. A flow of momentum here, a nibble of field stability there. Small sips that add up across nights, across decades. He put the sketch under a manila folder labeled FW. 7 because labels aren't proof, but they do tell you where to look next. They cued the operation. Sensors staged. Clocks synced. Story seated. He signed the form with a hand that didn't feel entirely steady and walked it to a door you can't open alone. On the other side, people who wrote in narrower sentences said yes. And the trap they'd only whispered about moved from a pencil drawing to a date on a calendar no one else would ever see. Operation Stillwater, the attempted catch. They called it Operation Stillwater because the surface had to look calm. A remote reservoir, the kind that sits behind a ridge with a single access road and a chain-link gate, became a lab for one night. They moved like a utility crew after hours, 2 trucks, amber flashers, clipboards. No uniforms with eagles. No cameras bigger than a lunchbox. The sensors hid in plain sight. Magnetometers bolted inside steel junction boxes. Hydrophones clamped in the intake throat. Secondary tape decks wrapped in foil and hope. Setup mattered. They needed coverage without announcing themselves. The magnetometers went in a triangle. One on the service road guardrail. One buried in a pelican case beside the spillway. One mounted low on a maintenance catwalk where no one walks unless a bearing seizes. Hydrophones dangled just upstream of the intake screen, suspended on taut lines with rubber isolators, calibrated by a hydrologist who insisted on checking the knots herself. Every instrument took time from the same disciplined source. A lab clock piped in through a radio link that the physicist tested until the second hand felt like a metronome. Bait wasn't a spotlight, it was paperwork. A maintenance leak. Memo about a bypass during a bearing inspection drifted into a channel where rumors travel faster than trucks. Engineers coordinated decoy lighting far across the lake. Soft pulses timed to grid load ramps. Dim enough not to spook wildlife, distinct enough to test a response. It wasn't art, it was a question asked in a language they were still learning. The night arrived with a dry wind that died right on schedule. Temperature inversion. Sound carried. The crew spoke in the shorthand of people who preferred their own tools to anyone's promises. At 1:07, the pressure at the intake held steady. At 1:11, the first magnetometer ticked 1 notch left. 11 seconds later, the lake changed. It didn't ripple like a tossed stone. It dimpled, a shallow depression forming in the center of a dark disk, widening without a source. The hydrophone feed, monitored in a truck with the heaters on low, went quiet where noise should live. The tech listening, 26, a ham radio kid who still soldered his own gear, leaned closer to the speaker. He pressed the comms button and forgot to let it go. "It's drinking," he whispered, like he might break it if he spoke louder. Pressure dropped 2 psi, then 3, then held steady as if a hand tested the grip. The magnetometer on the catwalk drew a smooth curve downward, a shallow bow that made no sense to a compass and perfect sense to the model. The decoy lights pulsed on the far shore, and for a heartbeat, the dimple shifted a few feet, as if sniffing. The physicist's mouth went dry. The hydrologist wrote a number she'd only seen in textbooks and underlined it twice. Then the EM spike hit. It wasn't a dramatic crackle. It was a thickening. Every speaker filled with a low buzz that felt more than heard, a 6 Hz ladder riding atop the world. The primary recorder, a solid piece of gear rated for worse, took the surge and died in a breath. The truck's dash lights went soft, and then came back without losing time. On the catwalk, the compass clipped to a vest spun and stopped, pointing at a heading nobody had taught it. Blackout. Not total. The reservoir lights held, but the service road lamps dipped, and the spillway camera turned to static. The team didn't move. You don't chase a shadow when the field is breathing. You let the instruments work. The dimple smoothed. The pressure climbed back 1 psi, paused, returned to baseline like nothing had happened. The low buzz thinned and lifted, a hum leaving a room. The magnetometer curve rose, overshot by a hair, and settled. The hydrophone started hearing the world again. Someone exhaled and realized everyone else had been holding the same lungful. Loss came fast. When they checked the primary recorder, the smell told the story before the panel did, fried. The secondary tape deck, a stubborn old analog that no one loved until that moment, had captured something with gaps where the spike had chewed. The physicist closed her eyes and listened to the holes, then smiled because even absence has shape if you know what you're measuring against. Within hours, retrieval began. A sedan with plates nobody recognizes arrived before dawn. Cases were lifted, signatures collected, copies promised and not quite specified. Non-disclosure forms slid across clipboards without small talk. The ham radio tech stared at the line that said "Forever" and signed anyway. By lunch, a transfer list circulated. 2 people found new assignments on Monday. The hydrologist marked boxes in her lab with a greased pencil that said "Archive" and locked a drawer she'd never locked before. Impact traveled up the chain like heat. An internal report drafted a preface that didn't sound like the usual posture. No public reassurance, no likely. Misperception. It opened with a sentence that felt like a throat clearing becoming a sentence. Observed transient energy exchange at water, magnetic interfaces consistent with targeted interaction. The analyst read it twice. Then he added a line that would headline a chapter no one would print. Final warning. He wasn't naming doom. He was naming responsibility. What they wrote next was never meant for us. Inside the suppressed chapter, the chapter wasn't bound. It lived as 3 stapled sections in a gray folder that smelled like dust and toner. The first sheet bore the code FW, 7 in the upper right, then a line that didn't try to charm anyone. Synthesis. No preamble, no throat clearing, just motive methods map. The kind of structure you choose when you've run out of time to argue. The motive page came first. It used clinical terms, the kind you can carry into a briefing without catching fire. Resource acquisition via system coupling. No aliens. No craft. The subject was behavior at interfaces where 2 domains meet, water under pressure and magnetic fields under load. It read like a shopping list with 3 columns: available gradient, transfer efficiency, risk of exposure. Reservoir intakes scored high. Spillway lips scored medium. Free water scored low. Substations adjacent to water scored optimized. A single sentence at the bottom slid the knife. Observed timing indicates opportunistic extraction synchronized to maintenance intervals and demand peaks. The word opportunistic did a lot of work. It said hunter without saying predator. The methods page felt like a lab's heartbeat. Transient field shaping, localized inertial modification, interference bands, and water interfaces headed short paragraphs with numbers in parentheses. The physicist's 6 Hz ladder showed up as LF banding observed at 5.6 to 6.4 Hz during interactions. Origin external. Amplitude correlates with pressure drop magnitude. Hydrophone entries read colder. Negative acoustic signature during intake pressure anomalies. Absence of cavitation. A boxed note linked domains. Paired anomalies, magnetometer drift and hydrophone silence within synchronized windows. You could tell they were writing for people who would fight them. Every claim came with a measured verb, observed, correlates, consistent with. No one wrote proves. They weren't that careless. Then the map. 3 pages reduced to 1 because the pattern didn't need flourish. Nodes dotted continents like constellations you suddenly realize are drawing a face. Megadams. Confluences where rivers braided. Desalination plants along arid coasts. Substations tucked close to water for cooling. A faint overlay traced field anomalies cataloged by geophysicists, places where the planet's magnetic fabric already sagged. The dots and lines aligned more often than you'd want to see. Not perfectly, nature rarely hands you straight edges, but enough to give the room that quiet where shoes stop squeaking. Dates sat beside nodes in small type. Those dates, the archivist later realized, matched public waves of sightings months and years apart. She took a pencil and followed a string from a desert dam to a coastal plant to a high plateau with a thin river and wrote a month beside each. The months lined up with drought declarations and grid advisories. She traced a fingerprint in the margin, of a real one, oil and dust, and stopped when she saw a name blanked with black, the rectangle cleaner than anything else on the page. She didn't try to fill it. She drew her hand back like she'd touched a hot stove. Redactions ran like scars. Names gone. Locations blurred just enough to be plausible deniability, just enough to keep anyone outside guessing. But whoever pulled the ink left enough bones. Drought indices elevated. Scheduled maintenance, intake bearings quarterly. Protective relays opened, transient fault unconfirmed. A routine dam drill showed up as unplanned flow test, casualties recorded, then a black bar swallowing the rest. The archivist's eyes stuck there. Casualties not in any public narrative. A corner of her mouth twitched like she'd tasted iron. One margin note in handwriting that didn't match the typed comm said, "If motive wrong, instrumentation aids resilience." Another line sharper, "If motive correct, current posture invites exploitation." You could hear the ethical pivot clicking in the language. The whole program had been built on contain panic. These pages swapped it for prepare quietly, not alarms in the streets, sensors on fences, magnetometers on catwalks, surge plans rehearsed without ever admitting why. The chapter's tone didn't make enemies by accident. It spoke like a surgeon, not a preacher. It told water managers to install pressure transducers with synchronized time, then told grid operators to widen record buffers around unexplained trips. It warned pilots to log compass wander without fear of ridicule and asked geologists to keep low-frequency monitors running through maintenance windows. The word vector appeared in a recommendation that carried more meaning than ink. In the event of sustained interaction, vector away from hospitals and critical care facilities via load and flow management. A redaction ate the rest of that line mid-verb, but enough remained to make the intent plain. If someone is drinking, steer them toward the empty cup. The human element didn't shout. It lived in one small note at the bottom of the motive page, penned in the same hand as the cautious hedge. If we're wrong, no harm. If right, the ellipsis did more than any paragraph could. The archivist ran her finger over it, then stopped again, because that's where fear lives, between the comma and the word you don't write. Dates anchored the science in a way conspiracy never manages. A winter night when a reservoir went still. A summer week when a city flirted with brownouts and people looked up because the sky had company. The map stitched those nights into a schedule no one had been meant to hold whole in their hands. Fragmentation had been the cover, split FW, 7 across agencies with mismatched codes, give each office a chapter and no one the book. But here it was, broken pieces taped back into a shape. Stakes rose off the paper. If true, policy couldn't keep juggling ridicule and reassurance. It had to move money, gear, and training. Quietly fortify interfaces. Teach operators to read a pressure drop as more than a leak. Tell line crews that a compass drifting together is a log, not a laugh. The chapter didn't ask for belief. It asked for behavior. The archivist closed the folder and felt the weight concentrate in the hinge, that small mechanical mercy that keeps loose pages from becoming air. She slid it into a sleeve labeled with a code that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to the few. They tried to bury it by breaking it apart. The only reason we can read it now is because someone somewhere taped the spine back together long enough to copy one more set before the cutters came. How the cover worked. Fragmentation came first. Not a single burn, but 1,000 paper cuts. FW, 7 didn't wear one badge, it wore many. The chapter's 3 sections were split across agencies with codes that refused to match. Hydrology flagged under infrastructure continuity. Magnetics under environmental noise, operations under readiness exercises. Each desk got a sliver. Nobody saw the whole. Public misdirection wasn't lazy, it was engineered. Blue Book's press tree leaned into the silly on purpose. Swamp gas got airtime. Venus picked up a second career as a scapegoat. Training flights and flares were handed to anchors who loved a wink. Hydrology notes vanished before daylight. Pressure drop at intake became lights over recreational lake. Magnetometer drifts turned into compass unreliable near heavy equipment. The words did the heavy lifting. The context never arrived. Career pressure kept the gears oiled. Pattern talkers learned the price. A major who tried to brief paired anomalies saw his portfolio shrink to weather summaries. A captain who wrote vector away from hospitals found herself teaching map reading to recruits. Meanwhile, the colonel who laughed off dam reports as fishing boats picked up a star. Promotions rewarded tone, not accuracy. Caution sounded like hysteria if you didn't say it right. Media strategy ran on leaks. The silly stories found their way out fast, blurred photos, dubious witnesses, a sheriff with a folksy shrug. The structured cases lived and died inside. A night operator's clean log went nowhere. A lab trace with 6 Hertz ladders was preliminary forever. Reporters who asked for water interface notes received sighting summaries, so polished they squeaked. When a journalist did land a sensitive memo, it came with redactions that ate verbs. Meanwhile, fragmentation ensured institutional memory bled out on a schedule. Every decade, the desks turned over. The code names changed. The routing stamps faded from violet to gray. The people who'd taped the spine back together retired, or left for jobs where time was paid by the hour. New analysts met the pattern as rumor, then as career hazard. The cycle reset like a calendar alarm no one bothered to delete. A drill that wasn't a drill left a bruise nobody logged. A dam announced a readiness exercise on a Thursday. Sirens tested. Gates cycled. Downstream, 2 workers on a maintenance crew were swept when a gate opened 3 inches more than it should have, then closed. The official line said operator error. The internal note sat under FW, 7 with 3 time stamps that matched magnetometer wander and a silent hydrophone strip. Casualties went unreported. Insurance paid. Families grieved. The file stayed gray. While that was happening in New York, a power company quietly installed surge protectors tuned to odd frequencies at substations near canals. The procurement memos cited lightning resilience. Engineers nodded. None of them wrote targeted interaction in an email. The gear arrived, bolted on, never mentioned. The field kept leaving fingerprints. The room kept wiping them with clean cloths. Unknown to them, across town, a university geophysics team pitched a magnetometer network for seismic noise. The grant landed. Instruments went up near rivers and along transmission corridors. Data flowed to a server with a password someone wrote on a sticky note. A week after the first clean sag trace appeared, a friendly liaison suggested archiving cadence adjustments. The team kept their plots. They stopped live-posting peaks. This was the moment everything changed for the cover. It didn't need to shout anymore. It could breathe. Fragment, redirect, promote the right smiles, and let entropy do the rest. Even the most diligent agent eventually moves on. Files migrate to boxes. Boxes migrate to basements. Labels fall off. The pattern waits. But fingerprints kept showing up in places redaction couldn't reach. A line crew wrote in grease pencil on a substation fence. All compasses drifted 3 degrees east at 2114. A reservoir operator taped a Polaroid of a glass-smooth dimple to a locker and circled the time. A pilot told his flight surgeon, not his logbook, that his headings slid and came back like a nervous thought. Human chalk marks outlived memos. The cover's cleverest trick was to separate verbs from nouns. Prepare quietly became maintain resilience. Vector away from hospitals became optimize load shedding. Install magnetometers on catwalks became enhance situational awareness. The words stayed clean. The meaning traveled under the floorboards. Then came a small breach. A routine FOIA request for dam safety drills turned up a line about synchronized timekeeping across interfaces. In an appendix nobody read. The journalist who filed it didn't know what she had. She mentioned it in a blog post that got 12 comments. 2 weeks later, the link broke. The web forgot. The paper remembered. Consequence wrote in silence. Without whole pictures, training manuals ignored the telltales. Operators learned to fix leaks and reset relays, not to read paired anomalies as a sign to push water and power away from the same node at once. When droughts hit, maintenance windows stacked. When windows stacked, sightings clustered. When clusters came, the press ran flares. And still, the field left the same soft bends and quiet holes. Even so, the field kept leaving fingerprints, paired time stamps, breathing needles, water that drew in instead of out. The cover worked right up to the line where a diagram in a suppressed chapter met a modern anomaly on a public map. And the moment those lines touched, someone outside the room saw what the inside had been trying and failing to bury by breaking apart. Reframing famous cases through FW7. Take the Phoenix Lights, 1997. Everyone remembers the V moving like a quiet roof over Arizona, and the later flare drop over a military range. 2 distinct events. That part's true, per public records and local military statements. But put FW7 over the night, and the first V stops being parade formation and starts pacing infrastructure. The V's path hugged the Salt River Project's canal spine, stepping between substations like a careful walker on stones. Witnesses said the lights didn't bob, they held height, drifted, then rose in clean verticals, classic rungs in air. Grid logs from that evening show load ramps and minor, unexplained relay chatter along the canal corridor. Not failures, tiny thunks that clear themselves. The V wasn't sightseeing. It was reading the bones of a city, water moving in concrete veins, electrons rushing to keep living rooms lit. The flares came later and got the airtime. The first pass matched the map. Zoom in, and a human moment sharpens it. A canal operator on the east side, off shift but restless, walked his dog and heard nothing except the dog stop. He looked up at a roof of lights sliding the canal line, slower than planes, too steady for helicopters. The dog's ears pinned. His wristwatch's seconds hand paused, then ticked twice fast to catch up. He wrote that detail down. It never made a press conference. now dropped south and west to the water where the Nimitz strike group trained, 2004. The Tic-Tac has been told a dozen ways, but the piece that sits squarely in FW7's box is the ocean itself. Pilots saw white water over a calm sea, churning without spray, like a sinkhole in liquid. The object didn't throw a wake. It wrote a column. A harvest lens says the column wasn't decoration. It was the interface. Hydroacoustic silence would be the tell, and while we don't get Navy hydrophone tapes, the language in the executive summaries reads like a negative. Disturbance without source, surface agitation without impact sound. Above, the object's acceleration stop insulting physics if inertia is locally shaped along field lines. It moves, like a surfer finding the gradient. Below, whatever's coupling doesn't need to scoop water. It asks it to move aside. Up in New York in the mid-1980s, Hudson Valley's boomerang glided over reservoirs and bedroom communities. Skeptics said ultralights. Others said a blimp. FW7 doesn't need either. It needs the route. The lights often lined up directly over the Kensico and Croton systems, tracing spillways and intake roads with unnerving fidelity. People reported a craft the size of a football field that could pause without bobbing. A groundskeeper at a spillway wrote that the water pressed inward. One night, like breath pulled through a straw you couldn't see. No one published that line. Utility logs noted minor protective trips with clean diagnostics. The pattern? Lights align with spillways. Substations flicker without failing. Reservoirs sit under a silent roof that prefers concrete mouths where water meets pressure. Cross the Atlantic to a colder mirror, Scottish locks. Fishermen told of silent lights marching low over black water, then animals on the banks fleeing before any sound reached them. Sonar returns went blank in neat ovals, voids where lake should echo. On shore, compasses crept 2 degrees and wandered back. A ranger at dawn found a ring of frost melted in perfect symmetry near the waterline on a night the air never rose above freezing. It reads like superstition until you slide FW7 over it. Sonar voids equal hydrophone silence. Compass creep equals field wander. Animals read pressure long before we name it. The lock exhaled, the field bowed, the lights moved with the same restraint we've seen over intakes. Stakes shift when cases stop being legend and become sorties. It's harder to tell a beloved mystery that it might be in operation. People want visitors bearing messages, not actors extracting resources. But the details line up where the press never looked. Timing against maintenance, paths glued to canals and spillways, paired signatures in water and magnetic drift. The FW7 lens doesn't erase wonder. It forces the conversation to grow up. There's a cost here. Reframing means letting go of comfort stories. It means admitting that a mile-wide V might have paced a city's lifelines, that a white cylinder over deep water could have been less a show and more a sip. It means the downbeat detail. A hospital's backup power test scheduled the same hour a light triangle lingered over an aqueduct. Stops being coincidence and becomes a question. Were we lucky or were we read and avoided? The suppressed chapter doesn't plead belief. It asks, when the one detail official reports ignore keeps repeating, the inward disturbance, the silent gauges, the breathing needle. How many times do you treat it as noise before you call it a pattern? One more beat. The archivist who traced that map page once sat with the Phoenix case file and found a small, penciled up beside a canal switchyard and a date beside it, maintenance at dusk. She wrote a note to herself she never mailed. Lights followed load. Years later, a public utility quietly tuned surge gear near that same corridor to odd frequencies. They called it storm prep. You can call it something else once you've read FW7. The modern echo, satellite-era anomalies. Once the FW7 lens snapped into place, the modern era started answering in pixels. Civilian satellites, thermal eyes meant for crops and cities, kept catching heat where there shouldn't be any. Reservoir embankments glowed faintly after midnight, a ghost warmth clinging to concrete lips while the surrounding earth read cool. Analysts chalked it up to residual sun until the pattern showed winter spikes with no daylight to blame. At 3 dams on 2 continents, narrow bands along intake mouths warmed and cooled in tidy, synchronized pulses. Not steam, not leakage. Thin signatures like fingerprints pressed against stone. Commercial thermal time series now make such pulsing visible. Agencies quietly subscribe and storm-hardened sites near water. Stakes first. Satellites aren't rumor, they're meters with orbit schedules. If they see heat without a source, the question stops being belief and starts being maintenance. Water managers live by gradients. A false gradient can trick a system into compensating where nothing broke. Multiply that by a region, and you get cities adjusting valves to chase a phantom. Hospitals don't want their backup pumps chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, power companies behaved like people who'd been told a secret they didn't want to say out loud. Procurement memos appeared for surge protection tuned to odd, low frequencies. Not lightning bands. Not standard harmonics. Engineers installed gear at substations hugging canals and intakes, then wrote "storm hardening" in the margin. Some added magnetometer stubs to fence posts and called them environmental monitors. Nobody held press conferences. Crews just tightened bolts and learned a new sound the yard made when the field wandered. Out at sea, satellites started mapping moving cold scars that argued with the ocean. Patches of surface water cooled in perfect ovals and slid against prevailing currents like a slow dance on glass. They weren't upwelling. They weren't river plumes. They moved with a steadiness that ignored wind. The ovals tracked near undersea cables and coastal intakes like shy shadows. Oceanographers labeled them transient anomalies and filed them. A few circled proximity to infrastructure on a whiteboard and underlined it twice. No one wanted to brief coincidence that neat. A microstory slipped through the seams. A hobbyist flying a drone at dusk over a small lake filmed rain rising in dead calm. Not mist. Not insects. A lace of droplets floated up from a disk on the surface, as if the lake exhaled through a sieve. The drone's flight log showed a compass drift right before the upward rain, and a brief loss of GPS lock that corrected without fanfare. He posted the clip online with guitar music. 2 days later, it vanished. His account didn't. The video just failed to load. He received a polite message from a regional park office about permits. He showed it to his brother, and then stopped showing it at all. Institutional behavior told its own story. Freedom of information requests clustered around hydrology were suddenly, in process, for months longer than usual. Routine drill reports arrived without the appendices that used to be there. When one agency did release logs, time fields were rounded to the minute, not the second. A polite lie privacy resource constraints covered the rounding. People who'd never cared about seconds learned to care. You can't pair domains with coarse clocks. While that was happening in New York, a private satellite company offered a thermal time series product to insurers. An analyst there, bored and curious, ran a query for repeated small nighttime heat pulses at dam faces and got a map that looked too much like FW7's. He flagged it to a supervisor who told him to focus on wildfire risk. He saved a copy to a thumb drive and mailed it to himself. 3 weeks later, a request from a federal address subscribed to their product at a discount. The analyst didn't connect the dots. He just stopped getting tickets for that query. The open loop arrived like a new mole on a familiar face. A node appeared where none had been 10 years ago, a megadesalination plant at the edge of a growing desert city. It had the right ingredients: constant intake under pressure, grid load humming beside saltwater gradients, maintenance windows that whispered like open doors. Satellite thermal images began to show faint bands of warmth along intake culverts on nights when the city ran hot. Control room logs, what little slipped, hinted at pressure deviations within tolerance that bunched closer to peak evening demand. The numbers were clean enough to ignore. The timing wasn't. Someone else saw the pattern and tried to say it the right way. A mid-level engineer wrote an internal memo. Recommends synchronized magnetometer and pressure monitoring at water, grid adjacency, correlate events, no public comms. It was careful. It vanished into review. 2 months later, the plant purchased surge hardware rated for frequencies no storm cares about and installed cameras that didn't aim at theft. They aimed at water. The sensors reported to a room without windows. What nobody knew at the time was how neatly the modern anomalies landed on the old map. The satellite heat scars traced intake mouths like chalk. The oceanic cold ovals flirted with cables and coastal plants. Substation upgrades bloomed where canals braided. FOIA delays stacked around the places you'd least want a pattern to be real. The field still breathed. The water still drew inward without a splash you could hear. The difference was simple and dangerous. We can all watch the sky now. Our instruments are in orbit and in our pockets. And when a new node lights up, when a city adds a mouth to the system, the pattern doesn't need to guess. It reads the calendar the way it always has and shows up where the gradient is richest. A new dot on the map means a new handle for a hand we still can't see. The whistle and the price. He wasn't the kind of man who made speeches. He filed. He labeled. He kept coffee rings off maps. Retirement didn't change that. It just gave him time to walk the long hallway of what he'd kept to himself. The colonel had spent 15 years orbiting FW. 7 without getting burned, then 5 more pretending golf mattered. What finally bent him wasn't fear. It was a granddaughter with questions and a cookbook with a loose spine that made a perfect hiding place. The decision came in a quiet kitchen. The map page, motive methods, nodes, slid out of a gray folder and onto a copier that squeaked like it didn't want to be complicit. He covered the telltale margin stamps with index cards. He fed the sheet. The machine blinked, shuddered, and gave him a ghost of the original. He blew on the ink like that would help. He folded the copy twice and tucked it inside a Betty Crocker, between pies and stews, because nobody steals recipes. Surveillance didn't announce itself. It appeared as a sedan 2 houses down, a man who read the same page too long, a click on the line when no one was talking. He told himself he was imagining it until the recital. His granddaughter, 6, in a dress with stars, lifted a violin that fought her fingers. During the applause, a stranger leaned just close enough to be heard over clapping and said, "We admire your service. It would be a shame to complicate your benefits." Then he disappeared into the crowd like he had a ticket. He slept badly for a week, then wrote a letter he didn't sign. He sealed a manila envelope. Inside, a copy of the map page, a cassette labeled 211 to 220 in neat block letters, and a note that said, "If you're going to tell stories, tell the whole one." No return address. He chose a journalist who didn't ask for belief, just documents, the kind who wrote short sentences when she was scared. He walked 3 blocks past his usual post box and dropped the envelope like it burned. The price didn't arrive as sirens. It arrived as a call from a benefits office with sympathy in the script and knives under nouns. A review of his pension. A question about his eligibility. A letter about health coverage pending verification. He called a number that rang in an empty room. He stared at a calendar with doctor appointments he'd been putting off and understood the currency of silence. He called his daughter and lied about the recital, said he'd cried because kids with violins always get him. He kept 1 photocopy. He slid it behind the cookbook's back cover where the cardboard holds firm. He wrote a shopping list on the flyleaf, milk, bread, batteries, and underlined batteries in case someone ever had to pretend they were looking for something else. He told himself he'd stop there. He didn't. The tape he sent slept. It made its way into a drawer with other envelopes that smelled like cigars and toner. Years passed. A producer left a station. A box moved apartments. One night, a junior reporter looking for B-roll found a cassette with a label old enough to be interesting. She digitized it and heard gaps where a field had chewed sound away, a low ladder of hum, a pressure drop you couldn't hear but could feel if you knew the numbers it sat between. She didn't know Operation Stillwater. She knew a clean minute mark. She matched it, by accident, to a public log of a substation hiccup 10 miles away on the same night. It felt like a click. She called the colonel. He didn't answer. He screened everything now. She sent a transcript of the tape's time codes instead. He stared at those minute marks and felt them lay themselves over nights he'd tried to fold up. He made tea. He put the mug down where the ring wouldn't mark the wood. He took the cookbook down and pretended to look for a pie. He checked that the copy was still there. It was. He smiled despite himself. Impact didn't break the news. It threaded a needle. The reporter shared the audio with a utility engineer who owed her a favor. He didn't say UAP. He said, "That's a transient I can't place." He compared it to a training tape for surge gear with the wrong frequencies. He shrugged and sent her a graph she wasn't supposed to have. 3 minutes of a substation's heart shrugging in time with a lake that had gone quiet without a splash. The alignment with Stillwater was too neat to ignore. The colonel finally picked up on the 4th call. He didn't confess. He corrected nouns. He told her the word siphon would be blacked out if she ever saw it in the wild. He told her to buy a real compass and a notebook with page numbers. He asked her to be kind to his granddaughter in her head, even if she never wrote that part down. "If the motive is harvest," she asked, "what's the timetable?" He laughed once, without humor. "You don't need belief to make a calendar," he said. "You just need maintenance schedules and the courage to read them out loud." He hung up, walked back to the kitchen, and slipped the cookbook into the pantry with the label facing in. He knew how much a page weighed. He also knew what it cost to carry it. The timeline nobody wanted. The colonel's answer sent the analyst back to what he trusted: clocks and drought charts. He pulled 20 years of reservoir levels and set them beside magnetometer wander indexes and solar cycle peaks. The spikes didn't line up like parade floats. They braided. Drought years showed more pins near intakes. Years with magnetic excursions, KP ticked high, auroras strayed south, showed more compass creep and grid stutters hugging water. When both happened together, the nights went busy. Stakes first. A timetable isn't trivia. It decides when a city gets lucky or tested. When water runs thin and the field runs loose, lifelines wobble. If extraction is real, peak risk isn't every night. It's windows. A bad week can do what a bad year can't. He penciled a cadence that felt like a breath. Multi-year drought phases set the table. Infrastructure growth laid out the dishes. Solar cycles dimmed the light. In the 90s, big build-outs around fast-growing cities added new nodes. Desal intakes, canal pump-ups, fresh substations and floodplains. The map brightened. The pattern didn't need to find us. We added handles. He marked alignments with maintenance. Quarterlies made small hills. Annual outages made taller ones. The largest spikes perched on all-hands season, late summer, late winter, when plants staggered downtime across a region to share pain. Those calendars leaked in plain sight. Press releases about planned improvements put dates on doors. Incidents perched near those dates like crows on fence posts. Meanwhile, the sun wrote its own schedule. Around solar maxima, the geomagnetic field loosens in character. More storms, more drift. Utilities already planned for that. They changed transformer taps, prep for induced currents. FW 7 added a complication. Selective, local breathing layered on top of global weather. In 2 maxima, the analyst found clusters of paired anomalies at lakes with thirsty cities downstream. The field bowed a little easier. The water listened. He added ocean to the ledger. El Niño and La Niña modulate drought and heat. During strong El Niño droughts inland, coastal plants ran hotter at night. Thermal satellite bands showed faint scars by intake mouths on weeks when inland rivers ran slow and grid load pressed hard. The windows widened. The schedule didn't belong to one machine. It belonged to Earth's rhythms plus ours. He traced a line through decades. In the 70s, fewer dots, less infrastructure density, fewer sensors. The 90s bloomed. Post-200, grids hardened, but demand grew. The last 10 years added meganodes, desal complexes, pump storage that reverses rivers at night, data centers sipping from hydropower. The dots multiplied where water and load share fences. The kernel's map aged into color. Projection felt like a throat clearing. He didn't draw doom. He drew windows. Next, high-risk bands clustered where drought indices trend red and infrastructure is new enough to be busy and old enough to creak. Megadams in arid belts, sprawling desal campuses on hot coasts, pump storage with deep intakes, river confluences near expanding metros. He ringed 3 regions on 2 continents and wrote months instead of years. People don't plan for 2029. They plan for August. Stakes sharpened to the point of names without saying them. Cities' lifelines hung on pumps that never sleep. Agricultural belts relied on timed releases that turned dirt to food. Shipping lanes threaded narrow margins where navigation already struggles when the field jitters. Hospitals ride the same grid everyone else does, but their tolerance for surprise rounds down to 0. Complication returned like a reflex. If you publish a timetable, you risk panic and noise. You hand grifters a script. You risk people seeing every ripple as an omen. If you keep it inside, you invite complacency in brittle systems. Fear management versus threat assessment again, but now with dates. The old fracture reopened in a room with more smartphones. Choices organized themselves like columns on a board. Fortify quietly. Sensors at interfaces, synchronized clocks everywhere. Playbooks rehearsed with clean euphemisms. Or tell the truth loudly. Name the paired anomalies. Admit the uncertainty. Recruit 1 million civilian eyes with compasses and pressure logs and the patience to separate weather from whisper. The first protects calm. The second buys detection. The analyst tested a hybrid in his head. Talk resilience, not visitors. Teach operators and line crews to treat paired signatures as triggers. When pressure dips and compasses breathe together, vector load and flow away from hospitals and high-risk nodes. Open alternate gates, stagger pumps, bias the grid like a gentle push. Do it without ever writing FW 7 on a public slide. Quiet can be honest if the verbs are right. He laid his projection beside school calendars. Holiday weekends, peak air conditioning months, irrigation cycles. The overlaps weren't pretty. Labor Day maintenance windows in heat. Winter storm prep stacked with quarterly valve tests. He wrote a note in the margin he'd once thought too dramatic. We aren't helpless. We are scheduled. What nobody knew at the time was that a quiet network was already forming. Utility engineers comparing magnetometer stubs at conferences under environmental monitoring. Water managers swapping pressure blip stories over coffee. Grad students stitching satellite anomalies with open grid telemetry. The truth had a timetable too. It crept. He ended the page with 2 sentences, one for each posture. If we fortify quietly and the model is wrong, we get better at running what we already depend on. Then, if we speak clearly and the model is right, we gain eyes where our instruments aren't. He capped his pen, stared at the clock he'd synced to a lab he no longer worked in, and wrote the part nobody wanted printed. Next window opens in 6 weeks. The final paragraph. The chapter's last page didn't clear its throat. It switched the verb. For decades, policy said contain panic. Here it said prepare quietly. The tone was clipped, almost spare, like someone removing adjectives with a knife. No flourish, no metaphors, just actions that could be funded and trained. The first recommendation landed at the waterline. Install sensors at interfaces. Not generic gauges, paired instrumentation. Pressure transducers inside intake throats with second-level logs. Hydrophones calibrated to recognize negative signatures, the absence of cavitation, as a flag, not a fault. Synchronize every clock to an external standard, so a dip at 2 hours 11 minutes and 7 seconds means the same thing at the plant, the substation, and the dispatch console. Keep buffers wide enough to capture the minutes before and after. Don't round. Don't compress. Then the field. Deploy magnetometer nets at set spacing along water-adjacent corridors, catwalks, spillway railings, canal switchyards. Favor low-noise variometers with drift accuracy, so clean that a 2-degree sag stands out. Tie them to the same time base as the hydrophones. If you can't watch everywhere, watch the places where water and grid shake hands. Train crews to log wander without rolling their eyes. Grid playbooks came next. Surge plans tuned to odd, low frequencies, the ones the lab saw riding the world at 6 Hz. Expand protective relays record depth around unexplained trips. Develop staged load shedding that isn't blunt. When paired signatures appear, pressure drop with magnetometer bow. Bias flow and power away from hospitals, NICUs, dialysis centers, and command hubs. The line used an unblinking verb, vector. Vector away from hospitals. The redaction ate the next clause, but the word survived like a nail that refused to sink. Language pivoted on ethics without dramatics. Treat UAPs as extractive actors, not visitors. It didn't argue origin. It argued behavior. Extraction means motives align with gradients, not with headlines. If behavior is extraction, then human duty is stewardship. Protect lifelines, minimize exposure, refuse to perform curiosity at the cost of resilience. The page read like emergency medicine. Stabilize first, speculate later. The human note that had haunted the motive page returned, sharper for being small. In a narrow hand at the bottom. If we're wrong, no harm. If right, the unfinished thought did the work. If we harden sensors and clocks and rehearsals, and the world is only messy, we get better operations. If we don't, and the harvest model holds, we keep serving dinner on time to a guest who doesn't ask. Then a practical clause aimed at courage. Disclosure is a posture, not a plan. Plans live in verbs. The page listed verbs operators could practice without ever saying UAP. Install, sync, log, pair, vector, drill. A paragraph warned against overfitting. A gust can make a needle breathe. A worn bearing can mimic a pressure sigh. That's why the pairing exists. 2 domains together cut noise. 3 pressure, magnetics, and grid chatter. Turn coincidence into a trigger. A narrow section addressed pilots and dispatch quietly. Log compass creep with time and position. Note sinus pressure, metal taste, and dog behavior without ridicule. Dispatch. When vectoring aircraft through corridors near water, grid adjacency during maintenance windows. Avoid stacking traffic at fixed headings. If headings drift together, widen lanes and ride the drift back. Don't make a straight line a religion. It didn't forget the ocean. Coastal intakes and undersea cable landfalls earned their own line. Install hydroacoustic monitoring with synchronized timing near intake culverts. Pair with shoreline magnetometers and cable telemetry buffers. When thermal satellites show repeating, narrow nighttime heat bands at culvert lips without daytime source, treat as an observation for correlation, not proof. Proof, the page admitted, belonged to physics they didn't control. Procurement got a paragraph that sounded like a shopping list disguised as policy. Approved purchase of low-frequency surge protection for substations within 1 kilometer of pressurized water works. Fund time distribution upgrades across water and power SCADA. Add magnetometer and hydrophone maintenance to routine checklists. Hide the funding inside resilience and storm hardening. Not to deceive, to survive appropriation cycles that punish specificity. Training slid in under continuity. Write tabletop drills that start with a paired anomaly, not a human error. Practice vectoring load and flow away from named critical care clusters without saying why. Measure response in seconds, not meetings. Bring in a pilot once and let her describe a compass that won't hold. Let the room hear a voice that isn't a graph. Then the single line that made the archivist look away, not because it scared her, but because it asked for adulthood. Assign responsibility to watch the calendar. Drought phases, solar indices, maintenance seasons, holiday skeleton crews. When 2 or more align, raise posture. No alarms in the street. No midnight pressers. Just a shift in how awake you are, written into schedules and overtime, and the way a crew keeps their boots on. The last sentence didn't lean. We owe resilience to those who can't choose where they breathe. The period felt heavy. The page ended there. No signature block, just initials someone later blacked out, and a date that matched the week Operation Stillwater came and went. The archivist closed the folder and thought about her fingerprint on the map margin. The final paragraph wasn't a siren. It was a checklist. It trusted that people who move water and power already live with gravity and time. It asked them to add one more breath to the way they listen. Field tests you can't misread. The chapter dared us to test quietly, so people did, without waiting for permission slips. The goal wasn't belief. It was signatures you can't talk away. Start with water rising without wind. Operators at a Midwestern reservoir logged a night where ripples reversed for 12 seconds. An overhead camera caught it. A flat disk where capillary waves marched inward like feet to a center point, not outward from it. No boat. No bird. Pressure transducers dipped one sigh and came back. A flag on the dam hung dead. That's not poetry. That's a profile. Grid fingerprints showed up the same way. Protective relays at a substation beside a canal clicked open and shut in a pattern the crew chief had never seen. 3 thunks, 6 seconds apart, clean diagnostics, no fault found. He hated writing no fault found. He added one line against habit. Compasses on site drifted together 2 to 3 degrees east during sequence. He expected a call. It never came. The note stayed in the binder like a match no one struck. Compass creep turned into a community test because compasses are cheap. A group of amateur radio operators bolted fluxgate sensors to fence posts near spillways and tied their time to GPS pucks. They didn't ask anyone for clearance. They set alerts for a slow, simultaneous 2-degree bow across 3 stations within a minute. Twice in 6 months, the graph drew the same neat sag while nearby water gauges hiccuped and a small substation logged a brief alarm with no equipment fault. They didn't post a thread about aliens. They mailed plots to engineers and asked for better antennas. Civilian science kicked in where institutions tiptoe. A university's outreach program built a kit, a pressure sensor with a stainless diaphragm, a low-noise magnetometer, and a cheap microcontroller with a disciplined clock. It cost less than a family's monthly grocery bill. They gave it to high schools near water. The rule was simple: never near intakes, always with permission, always logged to UTC with seconds. Physics doesn't care about excuses. It cares about time. A microstory traveled farther than a white paper. A school science club, 7 kids, 1 teacher who used to repair radios, set their kit by a fishing pier at a lake that feeds a city. They taped a compass to the railing beside the magnetometer like a joke. At 20 hours 14 minutes and 3 seconds, the pressure sensor dipped by half a sigh for 9 seconds. At 20 hours 14 minutes and 5 seconds, the magnetometer drew the softest V you've ever seen. Down, hold, up. The taped compass card drifted 3 degrees east and slid back. The kids didn't cheer. They stared. One whispered, "Do we call someone?" The teacher said, "We call the time." They did. The city's grid telemetry later showed a tiny relay chatter at 20 hours 14 minutes and 6 seconds down the shore. Nobody took their kit. The club printed the plots and put them by the trophy case like a quiet dare. Impact doesn't need a press conference. It lives in procurement orders that ask for exact parts. After 3 independent kits within 1 county logged paired events, a water agency's board-approved sensor modernization that happened to match the chapter's shopping list: higher resolution pressure transducers, wider buffer windows, GPS-disciplined clocks across plants. No blog post. New boxes on catwalks. Agencies watch the same internet you do. When drone clips of rain rising vanished and came back as rumors, a coastal utility installed hydrophones near intake culverts and stapled laminated cards by operator consoles. If pressure dips and magnetometer bows within 1 minute, notify dispatch, bias away from hospital feeders. The word vector never appeared. The behavior did. There were false alarms, and that mattered. A gust can twitch a needle. A pump test can fake a sigh. That's why pairing exists. One River Park's magnetometer bowed during a thunderstorm. The pressure didn't budge. The substation stayed quiet. The team marked it weather. Another lake's pressure dipped during a valve exercise. Magnetometers stayed flat. The grid was asleep. They marked it maintenance. The line between signal and noise sharpened because people bothered to trace both. Meanwhile, a volunteer network grew out of boredom and patience. Kayak anglers clipped small recorders to pier pylons. Hikers set phone magnetometers to log while they watched meteors. A retired machinist who didn't trust apps built an analog recorder in his garage that wrote the world's breath onto paper. He mailed rolls to a lab with neat notes. 2-degree drift, 3 hours 11 minutes and 12 seconds. No wind, ducks agitated. The lab wrote back, keep going. The test you can't misread is the one that asks the same question 3 ways and gets the same answer. When water rises without wind, when a substation says hello and goodbye in 6-second thunks, and when compasses bow together like a room remembering a song, you don't have to name a visitor. You have to respond. The chapter's verbs make sense out loud. Install, sync, log, pair, vector, drill. And here's the quiet win. Public data started forcing private adoption. After a county's school kits posted 3 clean, paired traces to a local science fair, the regional grid operator added low-frequency surge gear to 2 sites by canals and issued a memo about enhanced resilience during maintenance. They never said why. They didn't have to. The kids' plots were on a trifold under fluorescent lights where parents ate cookies and nodded at good work. A dozen engineers walked by, looked down, and saw their weekend reflected back. So what do we do when the next window opens? You don't wait for belief to catch up. You stage sensors where the handles are. You agree on clocks. You teach crews that a breathing needle is a verb. You tell a science club where to point a kit and how to write a time. Then, when the field takes a breath, you move water and power like you meant to all along. The decision window. A window isn't a prophecy. It's a plan with a clock on it. The next one opened on a calendar like any other. Maintenance stacked after a holiday, heat holding longer than the forecast, the magnetometer indices drifting toward lively. Cities that had been listening began to move without fanfare. The playbook started at the dam face. Harden the mouths. Crews swapped in higher resolution pressure transducers inside intake throats, then ran fiber, so every reading arrived with a second stamp no one could dispute. Hydrophones gained shields against grit and a cheat sheet near the console. If the line goes quiet while the gauge dips, call dispatch, not the foreman. Operators rehearse small moves, opening alternate gates 2%, staging backup pumps, but did it with the magnetometer plot on a second screen, so flow changes didn't chase ghosts. Hospitals got a quiet kind of attention. Network maps of feeders near NICUs and dialysis clusters went onto clipboards, not websites. If paired signatures appeared, dispatchers practiced vectoring, without the word, biasing load away along feeders that could take a nudge. A supervisor rewrote an old storm procedure to include one new line. In the event of simultaneous pressure dip and field bow, initiate staged shedding away from care clusters first. No one protested. The verbs made operational sense. Nationally, a new cell stitched water and grid together in a room that smelled like coffee and whiteboard markers. It didn't have a grand title. It had a hotline. Water managers could ping grid operators with a time and a node. Grid ops could ask for pressure plots near a substation fence. Shared clocks made strangers colleagues. Once a week, someone read the calendar out loud. Drought status, maintenance windows, geomagnetic alerts, and the room's set posture. None of it required belief. It required coordination. Disclosure strategy walked a narrow line. City briefings talked resilience, not visitors. We're adding sensors and time synchronization to keep your water and power steady during planned work in extreme weather, the mayor said, and it was true. Press asked why the magnetometers. Environmental noise monitoring, the utility replied, and that was true too. The public doesn't need a cosmology lesson to drink from a tap and trust an outlet. What they need is work done in the open that doesn't feed panic. The archivist who taped a spine back together wrote a letter he never intended to mail. He addressed it to his granddaughter and folded it into the cookbook as if recipes could carry courage. You won't remember the men who liked jokes about Venus, he wrote. You might remember the nights we lost power. Courage isn't shouting what you can't prove. It's protecting what you can't replace. If you ever have to choose between being right in public and being useful in the dark, choose useful. Then write it down for someone who'll need it later. Skeptics had their case, and it mattered. They pointed at storms that make needles breathe and pumps that make pressure dance. They warned about overfitting and the gravity of self-fulfilling prophecies. See enough patterns, and you'll find them everywhere. The answer wasn't argument. It was testing. Pair domains. Demand seconds. Let false alarms teach restraint, and real ones teach timing. You don't have to win a belief war to adopt good instrumentation. The open loop tightened with a name. The cookbook copy resurfaced when the granddaughter, older now, curious enough to pull books at random, found a folded page that didn't smell like pie. The black bar over a recommendation had missed one letter at the edge. It wasn't a signature. It was a surname fragment with a vowel and a consonant that narrowed the field to a handful of people still alive. The archivist closed his eyes for a long minute, then called someone he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. They didn't say FW7. They said, "You still have yours?" He said, "A copy." The other voice said, "Keep it that way." It ends where it began, one person, one page, a choice. In the decision window, the choice isn't between telling the world a scary story and staying silent. It's between acting like the pattern might be real and hoping it isn't. Cities hardened their mouths. Hospitals got quiet buffers. A national cell put clocks on the same second. A science club taped another compass to another rail. When the window opened, the field breathed. At 2 lakes, water drew inward without a wind, pressure dipped and returned, magnetometers bowed like a greeting. Substations nearby thunked and settled. Dispatch slid load along pre-planned lanes, away from care clusters. Nothing failed. No sirens. The story didn't end in lights. It ended in a shift change where a tired operator wrote, "Paired event, executed vector plan," in a log and underlined the time. The archivist's granddaughter played a better violin now. At her next recital, the lights didn't flicker. The cookbook went back on the shelf with the spine in, the copy exactly where he'd left it. He didn't believe less. He believed in verbs. And in windows that close without applause when people prepare quietly and do their jobs like the world is watching even when it isn't. The buried chapter wasn't about fear. It was a spare set of verbs for a world that breathes at our lifelines. Blue Book's public stance, 1947 to 1969, said no threat, while the Robertson panel, 1953, urged debunking. Modern efforts, AARO, academic field teams, quietly chase electromagnetic and hydrological signatures. If you want to see us test FW7 signatures live when the next window opens, subscribe and set alerts. Share this with someone who keeps water moving or power steady. They'll read the verbs and know what to do.